welcome back, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about a NIL case that some of you might know about, some of you might not know about. You might have heard rumblings, but I'm going to break down what exactly that is and why it might be the most important thing happening in college football right now. Then we're going to get into a little bit more of NFL draft talk. We're only about a little bit more than 24 hours out from that first name being called. Want to make sure you guys have all the intel before we go into round one. Then we're going to jump into Florida State and ACC. There has been a new development in that case where it sounds like it's possible that this case comes to a resolution, but I'll get you updated on all of that and what I kind of expect to happen there, and then we'll finish it up with a transfer portal update. We're going to take a slight break from the Spotlight Wednesday. I know that has been getting a ton of traction. Very much appreciate everyone watching that and leaving your comments. It means the world to me, so really do appreciate that. Before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to kind of have a fun interactive experience here, get on the show, I can answer your question, you can bring up a comment that I had forgotten to bring up. You can definitely use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. Huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to watch the show, have kind of a fun interactive experience with us, and it's fun for both of us. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in because there is a huge thing happening in college football that I think might have been a little bit overshadowed somehow. There is this huge NIL case that is going on right now that tons of people have been doing great reporting on, but Ross Dellinger over at Yahoo Sports, who is all over essentially everything in college football, did a great article a couple of days ago talking about this case and talking about the man that kind of has college football in the palm of his hand, which is Jeffrey Kessler, a lead attorney for the case against the NCAA. Essentially, the case, it breaks down to NIL has just been introduced to college football, and that's something that has turned a lot of heads in the direction of the past. When you talk about some of the players that had come before the NIL era, the Johnny Manziels, the Reggie Bushes, everyone that would have benefited greatly from NIL being a thing when they were in school, have now kind of said, well, how is this fair? If you're going to pass laws now, how are we going to get in trouble in the past for having taken part in these types of activities and this type of thing? So one of the big things that has kind of been picking up traction in this NIL case and in the world right now of college football is possibly back paying some of the athletes that were in college football and college sports in general from the past to kind of supplement what they would have made in NIL money. And it's a very interesting case. Obviously, there's a solid leg to stand on if you're arguing from the athlete's case or the past athlete's case, just because this is a rule that I think all of us agree probably should have been in place for a very long time. There were tons of people behind the scenes pushing for this for quite some time, and the NCAA just kept dragging their feet, and now they're kind of paying the consequence of that. So now the huge question about all of this and this case in general is, what is that dollar figure? Because when you read more and more about this case and you hear more and more of what ADs are saying, presidents are saying, even some coaches and things of that nature, no one thinks that the schools are going to outright win this case. No one thinks that the schools or the NCAA or the conferences, not exactly sure which entity would have to foot the majority of that bill, but it doesn't seem like they're going to win out in this one. It seems like their job now is to get that dollar figure as low as it can possibly be. Now, the dollar figure now, it seems to be sitting somewhere around like $1 billion in terms of back pay towards former athletes. So obviously a huge chunk of change in a time where money is hugely important, especially for these smaller conferences that are trying to make their way up to the Big Ten and SEC place in the pecking order. It's definitely something that could cripple them a little bit, and I think that's the biggest worry. And not only cripple these guys in the sense of the next couple of years will be tough, but there's a real reality where this bill is so large and so exorbitant that there are certain schools, there are certain programs that just can't foot it, that just can't deal with it, and can't handle putting forth that amount of money towards past NIL deals, because it would just put them at a remarkably bad position. I know we've talked about it a little bit on here, but athletic budgets or athletic department budgets are very razor thin. There's very few that, turn a massive profit every single year. You have a couple of sports in most athletic departments that make money. You have football that makes probably over half of the money that or half of the revenue that is brought in from the athletic department. Then you have the basketball teams at times, baseball teams here and there, but for the most part, most sports lose money in college football, and that means you're working with pretty much razor thin margins for the most part. So if a huge bill is dropped in your lap, it's not necessarily something that everyone can handle quite as easily. Now, one of the things that was brought up by Jeffrey Kessler during one of his press conferences after this was tried, I believe last Thursday was the first time this was in front of an actual court and an actual judge, but he said he was a big favor of a proposal that was brought up by the NCAA president, Charlie Baker, a little bit ago, talking about a different NIL and college football structure going forward. And essentially the idea is to have a new subdivision that can be opted in or opted out of, depending on where the team sits financially or where the school sits financially. And it would give an idea of, if you opted in, you would have a strict minimum that you would have to put into athlete investment. So essentially put into NIL deals, possibly put into an employment structure, which we'll get to here in a second. But I think it's one of those things that opting in and opting out is obviously a huge piece of this, because there's going to be schools that can't foot the bill. There's going to be schools that can't opt into this if this ends up being the final case, although I tend to believe the Super League might end up winning out here, which I'll touch on here at the end. But I think there's going to be so much around finding a new structure for college football, and I think this is one where obviously opting in and opting out is a great idea at its surface, right? It's a great idea in the sense of, you save some teams money while putting some teams in the catbird seat, putting them up top and giving them a chance to kind of run college football. But the problem is there's those small teams that won't be able to foot the bill, but, they still want to be a part of the party. They still want to be at the table. So it's kind of putting them in a really tough situation, to be totally honest with you, if that new proposal was the one that they ended up with. Now, there's been a ton of talk around different structures and stuff, and we'll get to the Super League and talk about that a little bit. I think one of the biggest things is one of the most impactful benefits of the new model is you would compensate athletes directly from kind of a trust fund. So the schools within the new division would be required to distribute athletes thousands of dollars additionally, additional educationally related funds without limit. So the idea is essentially they have this, huge stockpile of cash that they would have to pull from to pay these athletes in this new structure that Charlie Baker has thrown out there. So at the very least, it would kind of give us, some structure to the NIL world. We would have an idea of what every team was working with, what every team, that opted in at least had to do in terms of the floor. But the problem is there's no cap on his proposal. He says that there should be no cap to the amount of funds that they can provide an athlete. So this would obviously not necessarily level the playing field by any means in the NIL world. It would almost tilt it more in the direction of the Texas, of the Ohio State, of Texas A&M, a very, very deep pocket school. So tons of things to consider there. I think this is one of the proposals that, it has some pros and cons. I prefer a reality where, at the very least, everyone has a shot to be at the table. I think the opting in and opting out is kind of one of those things where you're almost forcing teams to admit that they, don't belong in the real world of college football anymore, which is a thing that I just hope doesn't happen. I hope we don't come to that realization. I hope that teams aren't essentially forced to opt out of this and become not even second-tier programs, but maybe not even programs at all down the road. So that's not necessarily my favorite necessarily of the proposals, but I'll get to one that I think might actually win out here in a second. I think one of the things that we have kind of gotten into throughout this time is that $1 billion buyback and the future compensation for model for athletes, right? So we've talked so much about the buyback and making sure that or back pay and making sure that all the athletes that were not a part of the NIL world get compensated for what hypothetically they would have gotten. It's largely not going to be a direct figure for all these athletes, but just gets a little chunk of change that they probably would have gotten while they were in college. The problem with that, or not necessarily the problem with that, but it does lend its way to a full new compensation model in college athletics. And that's obviously something that has been talked about for quite some time, something that pretty much absolutely needs to happen. If you were to ask me, I think these discussions have ranged very, very widely and have been kept mostly private. So there's not a good idea of necessarily where they're going to land on this number, where which teams are going to be able to foot that bill, which teams are going to be very nervous about footing that bill. But it seems like the numbers, at least going forward, would be about 15 to 20 million per year in revenue sharing. Now, this could all change depending on the model that they take going forward, because obviously that is a part of the puzzle, the revenue sharing and the possibility of introducing that into college football. But Jeffrey Kessler kind of gave 4 different ideas of what can happen from here until the next couple of months or the next year to get us to a place where we have a crystalline structure in place. And the first is the conferences can fully take over. It's something that has been happening for quite some time in college football, where you have these very strict divisions in college football, and you have tons of people making really big decisions for their conference, but they're not necessarily consulting with other conferences as they make that decision. Now, that's something that you can continue forward with. You can, all the conferences have different rules, and you're competing with each other to give your conference the best NIL rules for the players to increase, recruiting, to increase the ability on the teams in your conference. But it's definitely a very dangerous proposition, right? It feels like everyone would just be jockeying for position the same way that it is now. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that college football fans want to be gone from college football, is this idea that so much of the emphasis of what the future of teams is going to be is not necessarily on what you do on the football field. It's how much power you have walking into these discussions and how much power you have walking into these courtrooms. So it's a very interesting theory, I suppose. That is probably the number one that I am not a fan of, just because I think it would create mass chaos. It would create tons of rules changing every single day. It would just be a really, really hectic world that players, coaches, and conferences overall would just be remarkably confused by. Now, the second one is one that's been kicked around a lot, and that's the employment strategy. And obviously, that's one that is a little bit, has its pros and cons like anything, but I think it's one of those that a lot of fans are in favor of because, as we've talked about a lot on here, a lot of us are just craving structure at this point. We just want to be able to look at the sport and say we know how it works, which is something that has not been the case for quite some time now. And I think it's something that hopefully will start to change as more and more of these cases start to resolve, because there's plenty of them out there. There's plenty of stuff going on. In fact, tomorrow we will talk about the SEC and the Big Ten, a huge thing that could have happened out there that would have shaken up the entire college football world. But we'll get to that tomorrow. But continuing on with these ideas that Kessler kind of threw out there for ways forward, another one was revenue sharing. A settlement from the House case that produces kind of a revenue sharing model for athletes, which is essentially just, all of the revenue that is brought in from these schools, from these conferences in particular, with the TV deals, with all of the stuff that goes on behind closed doors that brings in just exorbitant amounts of money for these conferences. Well, now you'd have to give a little bit of that back to the athletes, which, in my opinion, should have been the structure for a very, very long time, but that's beside the point. We're here now, and hopefully that's one that they agree on, because it's crazy to me that the guys that are out there on the field that are, getting people to watch are not the ones that are getting even a little bit compensated for how much people watch. So I think that's a definitely one that has a lot of merit, and I think probably has the most backing in the college football world, at least from what I've seen. And the one that has probably the least backing in the college football world for probably good reason is Congress could get involved. They could, pass sweeping laws over college sports. They could give us, a really crystalline structure. The problem with that is, as we know, college football is not near the top of the list of priorities for the people in Congress right now. I don't necessarily envision them, coming to the table and coming to an agreement on a new college football structure when there are a million different things that they will be worrying about on a daily basis. So I don't necessarily see that as a viable option. Neither does Jeffrey Kessler. He said that even when he was laying out these options, he said this option is technically there, but probably not one that is actually viable or one that will actually occur. So definitely something to watch there. I think all four of those options have very different ramifications, obviously. I think employment would give us, a really solid structure. I think Congress would give us a solid structure, but maybe not the one that we're looking for. I think revenue sharing is a piece of the puzzle that needs to happen, but you got to have more stuff happening in terms of just the NIL structure, the transfer portal structure, all of that stuff just needs to be, refined a little bit more. And then the conference one is just a little bit dangerous because, as we've seen, conferences don't necessarily worry about other conferences. So Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti are going to worry about Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti's conferences. So it's kind of a dangerous game where you're giving even more power to the big dogs where they can kind of not only be at the top of the pyramid, but also control how the rest of the pyramid works. So it's a little bit of an interesting conversation, and I think all of this stuff will really start to come to a head fairly soon. I mean, a deadline on, the House case in particular for revenue sharing is in January. There are tons of things that kind of have to happen before that. They just have to, because when Jeffrey Kessler was leaving the proceedings on Thursday, he did make a remark that if this goes into December and nothing has happened since then, they are going to go to jury and they're going to win. If they go to jury in January, they're going to win. So a lot of stuff has to happen very quickly in terms of what is this back pay amount going to be, who are the schools that can pay that, or the conferences going to have to get involved, are the NCAA going to have to get involved, and can they handle it? All this stuff is going to be kind of happening very, very quickly, and change is going to be happening very quickly. I mean, it's been all over the place. There's been so many different things. I mean, we'll talk about the ACC and Florida State later in the show because some big news happened there as well. But all of this in college football, all of the different minor changes that are happening around the sport, all of the different, NIL ers and ahs that are being added or taken away, some of the conference realignment, all of that stuff, that could kind of be done away with this, the way that this case goes, just because this case sets off the domino of, okay, so now we need a really good NIL structure and a really good college football structure, and then the desperation grows. And then we've talked about it when we've talked about the Super League, is one of the good things for the Super League is there are a lot of people in college football that are desperate for a structure. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world necessarily for them to look to their right and say they have this structure. They have set up a full plan. We went through it last week of what this would look like. Maybe we just go with this. Maybe this is just the best way forward for the time being to get a little bit of structure, get a little bit of idea of what the future of college football will look like, and then you can tweak it later, I suppose. But I think it's one of those things that you're in a position where there's so much uncertainty, there's so much question around what's going to happen with all of these different cases and all of these different what look like minor cases at this point with the Florida State ACC and all of that type of stuff. This is the godfather of all of those cases. This is the one that will set off all of the dominoes that will affect all of those cases, that will affect all of those teams, and whether those cases really mean all that much down the road. But we'll get to that a little bit later in the Florida State ACC segment. But change is coming, and you just got to hope that it doesn't bury some of the smaller programs, because I've talked about it ad nauseum on here, but small programs are what make college football. They are what make it special. They are what get people as excited as they do. They are awesome, and they're part of what this sport is. So losing those would be terrible, and it's something that we have to try to avoid as much as possible. But we'll figure out what that bill is, and we'll figure out very quickly who can pay it and if they can stay alive in this craziness. So, of all the cases that we have covered on this show, this might be the most consequential. This might be the one that we look back on and say that was the domino in terms of figuring out what the future of college football looks like. Now, the question becomes, after this case finishes, is what is the agreement on? Where does that structure happen, and what does that look like? Because there are a lot of different directions they could go, and there are a lot of people that would be making those decisions that might not be quite as big of college football fans as I would like them to be. But we'll get into that as it kind of unfolds, as more decisions are made. But a very, very interesting case that definitely you should keep your eye out on, because it could affect whether or not your team has a football program in about a decade. But we'll get to that as it comes. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the NFL draft. We are only a day out from the first name being called. Want to make sure you guys are up to date on all the latest intel for the first round in particular, but also just some things to watch throughout the weekend as we get into the NFL draft. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.